Hello and welcome to CorpusCast, part of the Aston Originals series, providing fresh perspectives from Aston University experts. My name is Robbie Love and I'm a lecturer in English language here at Aston University. I'm a corpus linguist, meaning that I study linguistic patterns, trends and variations using large samples of language data. So on behalf of the Aston Corpus Linguistics Research Group, welcome to the show. CorpusCast is the show all about corpus linguistics and what it can do for society. In this series, I speak with top researchers in the field to find out more about how corpus linguistics can be applied to a diverse range of areas. In this episode of CorpusCast, our topic is how corpus linguistics contributes to research in the area of investigating and centering marginalized voices. My guest today is Dr. Mark Nartey, lecturer in English language and linguistics at the University of the West of England and member of the Bristol Centre for Linguistics. Mark works across several disciplines, including corpus linguistics, of course, to investigate how people deploy language in specific spatiotemporal and sociocultural contexts to achieve various aims, including identity construction and negotiation, self-promotion and othering, as well as argumentation, resistance, and delegitimation. Mark is a truly international scholar, having studied and worked in Ghana, Norway, and Hong Kong before now finding himself working here in the UK. So I'm very pleased to welcome to this episode of CorpusCast our special guest, Dr. Mark Nartey. Hello, Mark. Great to see you.
Hello, Robbie. Great to see you too. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you so much for coming on to CorpusCast. It's such a pleasure to get the chance to speak with you, and it's the first time we've really had the chance to talk about your work and corpus linguistics. So thank you so much for coming on. I wanted to start by asking you quite a big question, really. And I know that corpus linguistics is not fully sort of everything you do with your research, but it certainly informs a lot of your work. What does corpus linguistics mean to you?
Well, generally, I conceptualize corpus linguistics as a rigorous methodology and a powerful tool for studying authentic language use. So to me, it is a robust analytic framework that helps us to arrive at more accurate, more verifiable, and more reliable findings. And more importantly for me, I perceive corpus linguistics as very malleable and robust in the sense that its extent of application or applicability cuts across different spheres of applied linguistic research. So generally, when I conceptualize corpus linguistics, I think of a powerful tool, I think of a robust framework, and I think of a rigorous methodology that aids or helps us to engage with authentic language use.
Wow, that was a great way of putting it. I totally agree. I want to know a bit more about how, and this is a question I ask all of our guests here. And I'm always really curious about the answer because there's something different for everyone. How did you first hear about corpus linguistics and how did you get working in corpus linguistics yourself in your research?
I think I got into corpus linguistics sometime in 2015 when I was coming to the end of my MPhil research at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. So towards the end of that program, I started brainstorming PhD topics because I'd always had in mind PhD research and working in academia, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. So I started brainstorming topics. And as part of my conceptualization process, I spoke with one of my undergraduate lecturers. He's called Richmond Sadiq Ngula. Richmond, UCC, University of Cape Coast in Ghana, was a PhD candidate at Lancaster University. Indeed, he was supervised by Tony McHenry. So he mentioned the idea of corpus linguistics and more specifically, corpus-assisted discourse studies to me. So based on the preliminary information he gave me, I did my own reading. And the first paper I read was by Baker et al. On the useful synergy between corpus linguistics and critical discourse analysis. So that paper, together with other papers in corpus-assisted discourse studies, then shaped my orientation. And I used that information to formulate my PhD proposal and subsequently conducted my PhD in corpus-assisted discourse studies. So essentially, I'm going to attribute it to my 2015 encounter with Richmond Sadiq Ngula, who was a PhD candidate at Lancaster.
That's so great to hear. I remember Richmond well. You
Oh,
mentioned
that's
that
great. That's great.
yeah, you mentioned that he was supervised by Tony McHenry, as was I, and so I remember him from that time, and it's so great to hear that he continued to inspire others. And you mentioned, of
Yeah.
course, Paul Baker as well. Paul Baker was our first guest on
Yeah,
CorpusCast.
I saw that. I saw that episode.
Oh, great! It was great to chat with him, and it's no surprise that he's inspired so many other researchers. So that's really nice to hear. As I mentioned, you some of your work uses corpus methods, but I suppose more broadly, would you consider yourself a critical discourse analyst, sort of
Yeah,
first and
sure.
foremost?
Yeah.
And you use a range of methods, including corpus methods. A lot of work in critical discourse analysis, CDA, looks at how powerful entities like the media talk about minoritized groups. And certainly that's, a lot of the research that researchers like Paul Baker and others do would, I think, fairly fall into that category. And you do some of that sort of work, but a lot of your work focuses on discourses produced by these non-dominant groups themselves. For example, you recently published some work on African anthems of former British colonies. How important is it to take this approach of listening to the voices of those people who don't necessarily always have the platform to share their views?
I think taking this approach is extremely important because it helps us to highlight emancipatory discourses and, more importantly, to center the voice and the agency of non-dominant groups. So, as you rightly indicated, the majority of studies on non-dominant groups take this top-down approach. Okay, so the focus is on how elite groups or more powerful organizations like the media and politicians, etc., construct or represent these groups of people. Now, while I do not discount such research because I think it is very important, there is a need for us to continue working in that area because it helps us to expose injustices and reveal inequities, etc. So I don't discount that at all. We don't have to cool it down. I think we should continue in that area. But I also think it's necessary as part of emancipatory efforts and as part of shaping the perception of people regarding non-dominant groups to also foreground the perspectives and the voices of these people, more importantly, from their own perspective. And so that is why, I take this approach. And I think if we combine that perspective with the existing perspective of the top-down approach, that would be a more holistic way of engaging discourses on non-dominant groups.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've been working in this area for some time now, and I must say, when you look at your academic CV, it's absolutely astonishing.
Thank you very much.
The quantity, but the quality of your work. I hope you don't mind me saying that. I'm just in admiration of your work.
I'm humbled. Thank you very much.
Thanks. What does research and your own and others as well? And I appreciate this is a really broad question, so feel free to focus in on any specific context. But what does the research that you and others have done say about how non-dominant groups use language to perhaps construct their own identity and represent themselves in the context that we're talking about here of not looking at how do others represent these groups, but how do they represent themselves in their language?
Yeah. So here I want to share with you a recent special volume or special issue that I edited for Critical Discourse Studies on Emancipatory Discourses. So if you don't mind, I'll highlight 3 of the ways by which these non-dominant groups use language to construct their own identity based on the special issue that I did for Critical Discourse Studies. So in this study, I had a number of people researching feminist groups, other ethnic minorities, Blacks, etc., in regions such as Latin America, the Arab Levant, and Africa. And the summary of that study was that, one, non-dominant groups construct a positive identity for themselves by actively resisting discriminatory and hegemonic discourses directed against them. And here I want to make a distinction between actively resisting discriminatory discourses and exposing discriminatory discourses. So whereas the existing studies, from the top down, approach reveals most of these discriminatory discourses, there isn't always the case of active resistance. It's as though those studies assume or make this presupposition that once you've revealed, that is also an indirect way of resisting. All right. But in these discourses of the non-dominant group themselves, there is an intentional, there is a more explicit resistance. All right. And so that is the first way by which they construct positive identities. The second thing is that they use their language to foreground their voice and agency by speaking truth to power, and by so doing, moving away from discourses of powerlessness that have been often associated with them. So more often than not, the discourse surrounding these groups of people border on repression and powerlessness and their weaknesses, etc., etc. Which, as I said, it's fine. But when they speak about themselves, they also emphasize their agency, they emphasize their voice, they emphasize their power. And I think that helps them to reconstruct their experiences in more positive ways. And then the third thing that came out from that special issue is that they use their language as part of identity construction to engage in solidarity formation for group empowerment. So the idea of group loyalty, group cohesion, solidarity, alliance, etc., mobilization, they use their language to do that kind of thing. And then based on that, they move into more practical, actions. Yeah. So to summarize, I'll say, if you look at the use of language by these groups of people, it realizes an inspiring function. So I construe their use of language as discourse that realizes not just an emancipatory function, but also as an inspiring artifact.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds fascinating. And I think really, as you said before, can complement from a different angle a lot of the work that is done about how dominant groups speak about these groups of people, their own constructions of self. I think is fascinating, and I think this ties in nicely to one of the ways that you describe your own research, which is in seeking for the centering of marginalized voices. And I really like what you just said there about this is almost kind of, it's research to learn more, of course, but it's also research to give attention and almost to campaign on behalf or for groups that don't necessarily get the representation or the rights that they deserve. So turning to the contribution of corpus linguistics, as mentioned, you are a corpus linguist. What do you see as being the potential of corpus linguistics to contribute to this area?
The potential is great indeed. And one area I want to highlight is scaling up and the broadening of the scope of research. So as far as my reading is concerned, the few studies that highlight emancipatory discourses are largely qualitative and small scale in terms of scope. Now, in light of big data research, especially when engaging policymakers and non-academic partners, I think corpus linguistic research can make a significant contribution to discourses that center and foreground the voices of non-dominant groups in the area of scaling up these studies. Now, the reason why I think that is important is because the practical recommendations and the interventions that these researchers make, I feel, can be strengthened and be enhanced and be solidified from the point of view of corpus linguistic research. Because, practically speaking, anytime you engage non-academic partners or, collaborators, etc., they are big on generalization and they are interested in the extent of, what one is talking about. So even though we know it does not always apply, for practical reasons, sometimes there is a need to be able to generalize the things that you are saying, and there's a need to establish that the scope of what you are saying is bigger, than what it seems. And so, to that extent, I think corpus linguistic research has the potential to significantly contribute to work on emancipatory discourses. More so when at the current time, it seems corpus linguistic research hasn't quite focused on that.
That's interesting. So, I mean, is there any work in this area already from a corpus perspective, or is this really, a new frontier potentially?
So from my reading, the corpus linguistic work on this area focuses more on protest discourses on social media as an instance of emancipatory discourses. But I consider protest discourses as slightly different from the kind of emancipatory discourses that I'm talking about. So you're likely to find a lot of studies on maybe the Hong Kong protest, or protests in the Middle East, et cetera, which lend credence to emancipatory discourses. But I feel that is a bit different from ethnic minorities and LGBTQ people and racial minorities, et cetera, et cetera. So from the point of view of corpus linguistics, the work that I have seen is in the area of protest discourse. But as far as other non-dominant groups are concerned, currently, I do not think there is a strong commitment from corpus linguists in that area.
That's a really I think it's important that you say this, and I think that's a question really, is whether you think there is enough of a commitment in corpus linguistics towards what you might call the scholarship of non-dominant discourses, and your argument is that there hasn't been so far. What do you think needs to change? Do you think this is a sort of an attitudinal issue, or a practical issue, or the fact that by virtue or by their nature, dominant groups are potentially more visible, there is more data, and so it's easy. A lot of researchers who study newspaper discourse, for example, I would argue one of the main reasons, and they maybe don't acknowledge this all the time, one of the main reasons they do so is because it's one of the easiest kinds of data to gather, and there's lots of it, and so it's attractive to corpus linguists. But I think in discourse studies, perhaps we're a little bit over fixated with newspaper language. I get why. It's not a criticism of. I teach newspaper discourse at Aston. Lots of people do, and I understand its value. But I think sometimes CADS in general, corpus-assisted discourse studies, is almost kind of the subfield of corpus linguistics that looks at newspaper discourse mostly, and bits of other things too. Maybe that's a bit of a strong claim, but I want to know your thoughts on this, because I think it's really interesting.
I agree with the point you just adduced, which is more of the practical reason. But I think there are two main reasons. The practical, I'll consider that to be the second reason. But the first reason that comes to my mind is the tradition of corpus-assisted discourse studies in itself. So if you look at the history of corpus-assisted discourse studies, it started with research on non-dominant groups from the point of view of dominant groups, or from the point of view of the elite, which also goes back to the orientation behind CDA research in general. All right, because the orientation of CDA research is to look at the discourses of the elite, in relation to the commoners. All right, so that orientation is already there. There is like a school of thought already. So it seems to be the natural thing to do, to examine the media, to examine politicians, to examine more elitist discourses. So I feel consciously or unconsciously, maybe more unconsciously, people naturally work with that kind of orientation. So that is the first reason that I think I can adduce for the current situation. And the second is what you talked about in terms of from a more practical or a more pragmatic perspective. These non-dominant groups, because they don't really have the voice in society, they don't talk a lot. So you don't find a lot of their discourses. It is not easy for you to just build a 10 million word corpus on the discourse of LGBTQ people. I think it's very difficult to do that. All right. So in terms of for sometimes for good reason, these people choose to be silent. All right. So they don't talk a lot. Maybe you don't find them too much on social media. Of course, all this is changing with the progress that we are all making in the world. But generally, you don't find the voices of those people, out there. So it takes a lot more work to be able to get data from this group of people from their own perspective. So as you said, the media looks like an easier, not easy, but an easier way of getting data. So most people maybe, go with that kind of tangent. So I consider this as the two main reasons why there isn't currently a strong commitment from corpus linguists as far as research on non-dominant groups are concerned.
That's really interesting. And I appreciate I'm sort of going off script a bit here. It's just what you said is fascinating. So I want to stick with this for a moment before we move on. A question that always goes through my mind when, and you see people talk about this on social media, researchers talk about this idea of, well, someone wading in to a context and sort of saying, I'm a researcher and I've decided that I'm interested in your life and I'm going to gather all your data and analyze it and tell you everything that's I'm going to elucidate you with my grand knowledge. Of course, and I think there is a history, particularly in typological studies from decades ago, of researchers from wealthy Western universities flying off to some faraway land and recording people who are in a very, very different context, and writing a book about them, and then disappearing off and having a career. So how, I suppose from your perspective, then, how do you remain sensitive to the challenges of, well, are there certain groups of people, do they want to be researched about? And I suppose this gets onto the issue of sort of the co-production of research. For example, you've done a lot of work in Ghanaian contexts. And how does that sort of relationship sort of play out in your own experience?
Right. So I think, the point you made about, creation and collaborating with the people that you are conducting the research, about is an extremely, important thing. And that is one way by which, I approach this issue. So there is, I've forgotten the scholar's name, but he says something to the effect that such research must not just be conducted on these people or about these people, but more importantly, with them. And I feel sometimes as academics, there's a tendency to conduct a study on our participants or about our participants rather than with them.
And I think especially as corpus, in terms of corpus research, we're particularly guilty of that because, of course, the scale of the data we're gathering, we want to gather lots of data from typically lots of people, which necessarily makes it less personal, right? Because you don't just have 1 or 5 or 10 participants, you may have hundreds or thousands.
Right. Yeah. And of course, that is also, the idea of engaging the people also sometimes has its own practical, constraints. You need a time to do that, and their availability, and whether they want to do it, at all. And that requires, more effort. But I think that effort is worth it if we want to stay true to the ethics of the field and to make the impact that we want to make, which I'm sure we'll talk about, later. Then I think it's absolutely important that we do the study not just on and about them, but more importantly, with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned impact, because in linguistics and other fields of social science, there is for several years been an increasing kind of focus on the visibility of the impact of our work. And of course, applied linguistics is also very much at the forefront of that, corpus linguistics as well. When you're, as you said, a lot of your work sort of contributes to what you might call an emancipatory agenda.
Yeah.
And so clearly part of that is trying to shape opinion and start conversations and debates based on the work you're doing. How do you go about doing that? And what sorts of responses have you had to your research?
So at the present time, I'll say the main level of, if I can call it, impact that I've been able to generate is in terms of the dissemination of my research. So beyond, publishing, in papers and, advertising my work on social media, etc., I try as much as possible to sometimes do opinion pieces or to put my research in other forms that is accessible to non-academic audiences. So that is the main if like way by which I've tried to carry my research to the people out there. And so I consider this also as one of my challenges, okay, because, and here I want to make reference to my positionality as an early career researcher. I did not have a strong network outside academia yet. Okay, so emphasis on yet. I'm working on that.
Yeah.
So that is definitely is definitely a challenge for me, because the kind of work that I do requires non-academic partnership. And getting non-academic partnership comes with a certain level of popularity and a certain level of credibility and recognition in society, etc., which I don't have yet. And so that is maybe the main challenge for me at the moment. But and so despite this challenge, I still try my best possible to disseminate my findings to non-academic audiences, and that's what I've been doing in the meantime.
Well, now you've been on CorpusCast. I mean, that's all about to change. Whew, you're right.
I love it. Awesome. Thanks, man.
No, I'm joking. But that's a good point. Eleanor Semino said that as well. In her episode, she was talking about exactly the same sorts of challenges of working with academic partners, and that she talked about how this was the basis of non-academic partners, I should say. She talked about how this is a cumulative process that has taken much of her career thus far to develop these networks and these reliable partners. And so I totally appreciate what you're saying. And as a fellow early career researcher, I also feel the same way. That's really interesting, though. What has been
another? I was going to say another challenge that I personally perceive outside of the non-academic partnership is this idea that sometimes, for very practical reasons, it is difficult to adopt what I call an activist scholar posture. All right, and that is important because when you're working with non-dominant groups, the idea is not just to do the research, the idea is to effect change. And sometimes to effect the change, you need to be an activist or some form of advocacy. You need to embed advocacy, in your work. But there are times when, for me as a researcher, for one reason or the other, I find it maybe not feasible in certain situations to be able to do that kind of advocacy work. And so sometimes, I choose to be silent for good reason. And so that's also a very, very practical, challenge as well, where you can have the findings, but for one reason or the other, based on your reading of the situation and for depending on where you are, maybe in the world, it becomes more challenging for you to advocate for certain things or to be at the forefront of certain things. So that's also another challenge for me as an individual.
That's really interesting. How do you manage that? I almost see kind of two competing pressures here. Researcher as activist and researcher as scientist. And what I mean by that is, you mentioned Tony McHenry earlier. He's recently been talking about ideas of the scientific basis of corpus linguistics and rationality and issues around that. And on the one hand, in terms of corpus linguistics, at least, I think corpus linguists often feel a pressure to sort of say, "Oh, well, this is real science. This is really objective, and we have all these." You mentioned before, rigorous and replicable methods and things like that, and that all kind of implies or even explicitly claims a sort of bird's eye perspective. We're not involved. We're sort of looking from a distance, and we're observing and we're describing. We're neutral, right? We're just describing language. But you're also talking here about taking a stance, right?
Yeah,
taking an ideological and political position, which of course is really very much in the tradition of critical discourse analysts, as you said. But how do those two sort of live with each other comfortably? Do they live with each other comfortably, or do you see them as competing, or do you think that they work together well?
I actually think they work together well. So I see the two not as an either or, I see it as a both end. And here I want to reference John Richardson, who says that when we are dealing with social issues, we can't be neutral. What we can be is to be rigorous in our methodological procedures. We can be as robust and as detailed as we can in our methods or procedures, but we can be neutral in an attempt to be objective. And I agree with him that when you're dealing with social issues, it is important sometimes to take a stance and to be able to embed advocacy, within the research. So I don't think it is an either or at all. I think, yes, you can be scientific and you can also be subjective or take a stance and explain this positionality. So I think it's an issue of positionality, and you should be able to engage with your positionality and explain why you have that positionality.
Absolutely. That's. I think there's a lot of food for thought here. This is honestly, it's so interesting to get the chance to talk with you about this. So thanks so much. We'll start to wrap things up, and I have a series of so-called quick questions that I like to ask my guests, and sometimes the answers are quick and sometimes they're not. That's fine. We've got plenty of time. What are the biggest changes that you've noticed in corpus research in your career so far?
So from 2015 up until now, which is a very short engagement, with Corpus Linguistics, I'll say there's been a number of, changes. The field has evolved. The field has witnessed, as far as I'm concerned, tremendous, progress. And here I want to highlight three main changes. The first is in the scope of work and the regional and geographical distribution of the studies. So currently, corpus linguistic methods are being applied in nearly all fields of linguistics. And for me, that is amazing. It gives us a clear indication of how the field has evolved, and the level of acceptability of the framework is incredible. And in terms of geographical distribution, I did a meta-analysis of corpus-assisted discourse studies in 2019, where it was evident that areas like Africa and South America and the Arab Levant and even Oceania weren't that big, on corpus linguistics. But in recent years, the work in these areas has tremendously, increased. Right. So in terms of scope, both in terms of applicability of the framework to other applied linguistic research and the geographical and regional or areal distribution of the studies, I think the field has come a long way. And that is the first change that I see. The second is in the development of new tools and software, as well as the upgrade of existing ones. I think that is like a mainstay, really. So, and I know you have done certain things in that area as well, especially in terms of building, new corpora, and stuff like that. So I think the field has not been static at all. It's been very dynamic, and it's been onward, forward, and upward. And the final change I want to talk about relates to the podcast you are doing now, and that borders on impact. I think in recent years, there's been an intentional and a systematic attempt to foreground impact in corpus linguistic research. And this podcast, without a doubt, is one of them. And I want to commend you and your team for this innovative, idea. So in the last few years, there's been a lot of emphasis on impact. And, I've seen a lot of YouTube videos and workshops on corpus linguistics and impact. And I've been in conferences where, it has been the main focus. I've been in panels and workshops and things like that. So I think there is an intentional effort, at making impact, which I think is a very good thing, because we don't just want to do the research. More important, we want to carry that research into society and hopefully make the world a better place. So these are the three main changes that I'll say I've observed in the last few years that have been part of corpus linguistics.
Well, thank you. I appreciate what you said there about this show. I see this as one sort of small way of contributing to what I agree is an increasing visibility of corpus linguistics in general. And I agree that we've been working for a similar sort of period of time, and yes, it's only a few years, but even in that short space of time, I agree that there has been a big change even in that short space of time. And that's really interesting compared to what those who've been doing this for decades, say about the changes that they've noticed, which is a lot more to do with the scale, as you can imagine, of the size of the data sets and the power and sophistication of the tools. But even in the last few years, there are these really interesting and important changes. My second question is a new one. I haven't asked this to anyone before, so you get the first go at answering this one. What is the biggest misconception of corpus linguistics that you have encountered?
One of the big ones for me is this idea that corpus linguistics is all about using computers or pressing certain, buttons on the computer in order to get results. Now, this misconception is linked to the idea that corpus linguistics is easy or it is easier in comparison with other analytic approaches in linguistics. So people have the misconception that, for instance, it is possible to become a corpus linguistic expert in one workshop or in one summer school. And so sometimes when you engage non-academic partners and you make them aware of how powerful this tool is and how useful it can be, they have the tendency to think that you can just run maybe a 1-week workshop or a 3-day workshop for their staff, and boom, they can become experts in corpus linguistics, and they can also use the tools and all of that, which I feel is a misconception. So definitely, from one of the biggest is this idea that it's all about computers and it's fancy, and it's about some tools that you can apply and you can get this fascinating results and you can just run away with them and do the infographics and all of those shiny stuff.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you say that, because I get this a lot as well. I totally agree. People think you just press a few buttons and look at some numbers and go, oh, that's interesting. This has gone up and this has gone down. But ultimately, it is still linguistics. And so,
absolutely,
first and foremost, it's very easy for people to say, oh, I'm a corpus linguist, as if it's completely different. But, first and foremost, we're linguists. We study language, and it's one of many methods that people may choose to use. So that's reassuring to hear you say that as well. My final question to you is a bit more, well, I hope optimistic. We'll see what you think. How will, or perhaps could corpus linguistics make an impact on the world in the future?
Here I want to start by referencing Paul Baker in one of his talks on impact. He goes like, impact is a long-term game. And I think it's very important for all of us to appreciate that assertion. Absolutely, impact is a long-term game. And so this is the way I'll respond to your question. I'll say that all the things that we are doing now, whether in forensic linguistics, non-dominant groups, health communication, all the other areas of corpus linguistics, application, I think in 20, in 50, in 100 years' time, those things are going to have even greater and even stronger impact. So I see our impact as cumulative. Yes, even though there is even impact now, I think what we're doing now is even going to have much greater impact, in several years to come. So beyond the things that would happen in big data research and artificial intelligence and all those other incredible fields, which I still think corpus linguists can contribute to, I feel that the little things that we are even doing now would have a ripple effect and would gather momentum and have much greater impact in years to come.
You know what? That is really, really optimistic, even more optimistic than I thought, which is great. Yeah, I hope to join you on this journey, maybe in 30 years' time, when maybe we're starting to slow down a little bit. we
Yeah.
we can come back and do this again and see what happened.
Sure.
We're in it for the long term. So yeah, that's
Definitely.
great. That's great. Well, Mark, again, thank you so much for coming on. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I really appreciate your time. I will start to bring things to a close here, and address the camera, our viewers, if you're watching us on YouTube, of course. And if you're not watching but listening, whether that's on Spotify, Google Podcast, Podcast Addict, or Podchaser, thank you very much for joining us on CorpusCast. Please do let us know your thoughts about this and other episodes in the series using the hashtag CorpusCast. And make sure to check out the Aston Corpus Linguistics Research Group on Twitter at Aston Corpus. CorpusCast is an Aston Originals podcast written and hosted by yours truly, Robbie Love, and produced by Sam Cook. Thank you, Mark Nartey, once again for joining us. Thank you for watching or listening, and I hope to see you again on a future episode of CorpusCast. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Robbie, for the invite. I'm truly grateful.